Blank, The Ghost of Trinity, an American epic of science, espionage, and the dawn of the atomic age. Hook. In the summer of 1945, a blinding, multicolored flash erupted over the New Mexico desert, painting the pre-dawn sky with an unearthly glow. For one terrifying, exhilarating moment, the men who witnessed it forgot the war, forgot their homes, and forgot the very laws of physics. They had just detonated the world's first atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity. But as the monstrous mushroom cloud began its slow, inevitable ascent, one man among the witnesses, the brilliant but haunted physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, quoted the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The history books tell you this was a story of American genius, of $2 billion, 130,000 workers, and 3 years of relentless secret labor, known as the Manhattan Project. But they almost always leave out the most astonishing truth. The project's biggest secret was that it was founded on a colossal lie, one whispered by a scientist whose loyalty was not to America, but to a rival superpower. This is the true, untold story of the hidden hands, the spies, the political manipulators, and the forgotten heroes who didn't just help build the bomb, but who set the entire improbable machine in motion. It's a tale of moral conflict, surprising alliances, and the moment a terrified world stared into its own annihilation. Chapter 1. The Emigres and the Edge of Physics. The Letter That Changed History. The year is 1939. Europe is a cauldron, poised to boil over. In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Princeton, New Jersey, the world's most famous scientist is enjoying a relatively peaceful existence, oblivious to the seismic shift he is about to cause. Albert Einstein, a German Jewish refugee whose very presence in the U.S. symbolizes Europe's loss and America's gain, is focused on refining his unified field theory. He had no direct involvement in atomic physics research at this time, yet his name would become the symbolic fuse for the bomb. The real catalyst, the man who understood the terrifying potential of German science, was not Einstein, but his fellow Hungarian émigré Leo Szilard. Szilard was a genius, a quirky polymath who conceived the idea of the nuclear chain reaction while waiting for a London traffic light to change in 1933. He had witnessed the rise of Nazi brutality firsthand, and he was convinced that German scientists, led by Nobel laureate Werner Heisenberg, were already working on a uranium-based weapon. The urgency Szilard felt was a cold, crippling fear, the kind that makes a rational man ignore every rule of social decorum and political protocol. The U.S. government, however, was deaf to the anxieties of a handful of foreign-born scientists. The concept of a weapon that could destroy a city was too fantastical for politicians worried about mundane things like tank production and troop mobilization. Szilard needed a loudspeaker. He needed a name that could not be ignored, even by the most skeptical bureaucrat. He needed Einstein. In July 1939, Szilard and his colleague, Eugene Wigner, drove to a remote cabin on Long Island where Einstein was vacationing. Szilard explained the physics, that a chain reaction in a mass of uranium could unleash a truly enormous amount of power. Einstein, who had famously declared that he did not believe atomic energy would be unleashed in my time, listened intently, his famous shock-white hair perhaps bristling slightly at the possibility. The scientists drafted a letter. It was polite, formal, and utterly chilling. The final version, dated August 2, 1939, and addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, contained the most fateful paragraph ever written to a U.S. president. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port, together with some of the surrounding territory. The surprising detail? The letter was not delivered immediately. A series of bureaucratic missteps, delays, and political handoffs meant the letter didn't actually reach President Roosevelt until October 11, 1939, more than a month after Hitler invaded Poland and formally began World War II. Szilard had raced against time, only to be stalled by a slow-moving administrative machine. When Roosevelt finally read the document, he reportedly remarked, "This requires action." The Manhattan Project was conceived in that moment, but its birth was agonizingly slow. The scientific frontier at the University of Chicago. While the military bureaucracy slowly stirred, the theoretical work began in earnest in laboratories across the U.S. The spiritual heart of the early project was the University of Chicago, nestled beneath the university's football stands in a decommissioned squash court named Stagg Field. Here, under the brilliant but demanding leadership of Enrico Fermi, another émigré who had fled fascist Italy with his Swedish wife, a team worked on the impossible, building the world's first nuclear reactor, codenamed CP-1. The operation was medieval in its simplicity and terrifying in its danger. There were no concrete bunkers or advanced cooling systems. The reactor was literally a lattice of uranium and graphite bricks, painstakingly assembled by hand. The graphite, needed to slow down the neutrons to sustain the chain reaction, were so essential that the scientists became obsessive about its purity. Impure graphite would poison the reaction, and the initial batches were all unusable. The team essentially had to invent the industrial process for manufacturing nuclear-grade graphite from scratch. The astonishing detail? The team that built the reactor, nicknamed the MetLab team, was composed of scientists, engineers, and even a number of high school dropouts and tradesmen. Because the entire operation was conducted in extreme secrecy, the military took absurd measures to protect the project's cover. The physicists' orders to procure tons of uranium oxide were filed under the guise of an entirely different, mundane goal: developing a more efficient type of water boiler. A euphemism so innocuous it worked perfectly. In fact, many of the workers who handled the dangerous materials believed they were working on a sophisticated power plant. On the morning of December 2, 1942, the tension in the squash court was unbearable. Fermi stood on a platform overlooking the massive black pile of blocks, which resembled a gigantic crude wedding cake. Control rods, designed to absorb neutrons and shut down the reaction, were slowly being pulled out. A young, nervous scientist named George Wheel stood ready with an emergency shut-off axe, prepared to cut a rope that would drop the final cadmium-plated control rod into the core, the only thing standing between them and a runaway reaction. At 3:25 p.m., Fermi calmly announced, "The reaction is self-sustaining." There was no explosion, no flash, but the quiet click of counters registering the controlled release of atomic energy. The room was silent for a moment. Then a wave of stunned relief washed over the exhausted team. Eugene Wigner, ever the proper gentleman, produced a bottle of Chianti that he had smuggled in a brown paper bag. They drank the wine in paper cups, celebrating not just a scientific success, but the end of one era and the frightening beginning of another. This moment, the first controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, was the true scientific birth of the atomic age. From that point on, it was no longer a matter of if a bomb could be built, but how fast it could be finished. Mountain, Chapter 2, The Secret City and the Haunted Genius. The Hill. To build a weapon that promised to end the war, the U.S. government needed two things: genius and isolation. They found both in a remote corner of New Mexico, a secluded flat-topped mesa known as the Pajarito Plateau. This was the site chosen for Project Y, the central laboratory where the theoretical physics of Chicago would be transformed into functional bombs. The official name for the new town was Los Alamos. It was an exercise in utter necessary deception. Every letter was routed through a fake post office box, Box 1663, Santa Fe,